Now, we need to remember the question before the court is pretty narrow. The question before the court is narrow: whether counting ballots postmarked by Election Day but received up to 5 days later violates the federal Election Day statute. Plaintiffs do not challenge the general practice of absentee voting, the use of postal service or common carriers to transmit ballots, early voting, or the counting and certification of votes after Election Day. The court also does not consider the scope of Congress's authority to regulate federal elections. Well, isn't that interesting? The court has decided not to consider the scope of the very laws they are reviewing. How can the court decide whether or not the Mississippi law violates federal law without determining if the law made by Congress was made pursuant to the Constitution? Otherwise, that federal law would not be the supreme law of the land and, in fact, should be considered null and void. The federal Election Day statutes do not preempt Mississippi's law because the defining element of an election has always been the elector's choice of candidate. Is that the full definition of an election? Because according to Webster's 1828 dictionary, an election is the act of choosing, choice, the act of selecting one or more from others, hence appropriately, the act of choosing a person to fill an office or employment by a manifestation of preference as by ballot, uplifted hands, or via voce, as the election of a king, of a president, or a mayor. Is the act of choosing complete before the choice is recorded? In other words, is the election complete before the votes are counted? And how can the votes be counted if they haven't even arrived yet? In a related federal statute, the Uniform and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act confirms that while federal law dictates when ballots must be cast, state law governs when they must be received. Interesting, because I took a quick look at UOCAVA, and it does generally follow state deadlines except for when delivered by United States Postal Service. Except as provided in subparagraph B, the deadline described in this paragraph is noon in the location in which the ballot is collected on the 7th day preceding the date of the regularly scheduled general election for federal office. If the presidential designee determines that the deadline described in subparagraph A is not sufficient to ensure timely delivery of the ballot under paragraph 1 with respect to the particular location because of remoteness or other factors, the presidential designee may establish as an alternative deadline for that location the latest date occurring prior to the deadline described in subparagraph A, which is sufficient to provide timely delivery of a ballot under paragraph 1. Even if the presidential designee determines that the deadline isn't sufficient for a specific location, they can choose an alternative. However, that alternative must occur prior to the deadline of the 7th day preceding the date of the regularly scheduled general election, meaning that ballots must arrive before Election Day. That still leaves us with the question about when an election is complete. The electorate's choice is made when voting is complete, not when ballots are received. The most recent amendment to the Presidential Election Day statute bears this out. While inserting the phrase Election Day into the statute and marking that date as a specific Tuesday, Congress also provided that when states modify the period of voting in response to some force majeure event, the term Election Day shall include the modified period of voting. That's shown in Title 3 U.S.C. Section 21, Sub 1. Now, I'd love it when people, especially judges, contradict their own arguments. Because as the court noted, under 3 U.S.C. Section 21, states can only modify the period of voting when the state appoints electors by popular vote, which is every state, if it is necessary by force majeure, which is an event that is a result of an element of nature as opposed to one caused by human behavior. So under this law, states can only extend the election day in response to a natural or otherwise extraordinary situation. Mississippi law is not force majeure. The court also ignored the fact that the law they are quoting only applies to the appointment of presidential electors. Finally, this interpretation is consistent with the Constitution's requirement for the Electoral College. The Constitution requires the day on which electors shall give their votes to be the same throughout the United States, but says nothing about the day for receipt. Except the quote the court took for this example is not Election Day, but a day for the electors for president and vice president to give their votes, which is in December. The Constitution states not only that Congress sets the day on which presidential electors vote, but the day they are chosen. And that, according to 3 U.S.C. Section 1, is the electors of president and vice president shall be appointed in each state on Election Day in accordance with the laws of the state enacted prior to the election day. How can states which choose their presidential electors by popular vote do so on Election Day as Congress established if their elections are not counted by that date? The Constitution thus envisions a system in which receipt of votes is necessarily divorced from voting, and it sets the crucial uniform day as the day of voting while leaving receipt to happen later. The federal Election Day statute followed the same pattern. Nothing in the Constitution divorces the act of casting a vote from its receipt and counting. Then again, nothing in the Constitution explicitly states that an election includes the casting, collecting, and counting of ballots.